Good evening and welcome to Rice University. My name is Zach Bethune. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Economics here at Rice. I want to welcome all of you in the audience and also all of you that are joining us virtually from around the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Rice Initiative for the Study of Economics, or RISE, lecture series by Nobel laureate Thomas Sargent. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of the series and then introduce our distinguished speaker today. The RISE lecture series was created in 2015 by a generous gift from one of our own Rice and Department of Economics alumni, Doyle Arnold. Doyle also serves on the RISE Council, is chair of the School of Social Sciences Advisory Board, and is a trustee emeritus of Rice University Board of Trustees. He's done a lot for the university. Unfortunately, Doyle could not be here tonight, but please join me in thanking him for his generous contribution that makes this lecture series possible. This is now the 12th keynote lecture in the RISE series that has brought numerous Nobel-winning, prize-winning, and other distinguished economists to Rice, including now a second visit from our distinguished speaker. Today's lecture is also serving as the centerpiece of a two-day academic conference, the RISE Inflation Conference, that has brought leading experts to campus to discuss their frontier research on past and present inflationary episodes. And we welcome all of those who are joining us in the audience. Which brings me to today's lecture. Of course, the topic could not be any more timely. Inflation in the US is currently higher than it has been in 40 years. Many of us in the audience, particularly the students here, are lifetimes. Policymakers around the world are trying to strike a delicate balance between taming inflation and initiating a recession. In a world economy and environment that is seemingly so different than we've ever experienced. With that as context, there is perhaps no one better equipped than our speaker, Nobel laureate Thomas Sargent of New York University, to share his research with us today. I say there's no one better than Tom, really for two reasons. The first is that if I were to take the time to list all of Tom's accomplishments and really explain his so many contributions to the field of macroeconomics, I would be speaking for the entire hour, and we don't want that. Quickly, though, he's not only a Nobel laureate, shared with Chris Sims of Princeton, but he also won the Distinguished Nemers Prize that recognizes major contributions to the fields of economics. If my count's right, he's published or written 268 independent works, independent papers, has amassed nearly 16,000 citations, and he's written 15 books, including the standard that's used to teach graduate macroeconomics around the world. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, and he served as president of all the major professional societies of economists. And, which I like to mention, he was a first lieutenant and a captain in the US Army. The second reason I say there's no one better than Tom is that his research has specifically been vital in advancing our understanding of past inflationary episodes. A major contribution, not his only contribution, but a major contribution in which he was awarded the Nobel Prize was in developing new models and techniques that proved successful in understanding the high inflationary episode of the 1970s and the policy changes that led to nearly 40 years of stable inflation. He really helped revolutionize the field of monetary economics and the role of expectations, and his research still guides policymakers today. So in some sense, Tom has been here before, conducting research where current macroeconomic models are having to cope with the current inflationary episode. No pressure, Tom. But I know I look forward to seeing his views, particularly his past research, can help us think about the current inflationary episode. Okay, so without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Thomas Sargent.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so for people who have been participating in this conference, you're going to see this is the low point of this two-day conference in a whole bunch of ways. Technically and in terms of how modern it is. So here it goes. I'm going to describe some old work that I did partly by myself, but partly with some friends. And it's Conquests of American Inflations, and it's going to be north and south. So that's where I'm going. And first, there's some infrastructure. This is for people who were at the conference and more. I'm just show you this first slide. So there's going to be some things in play. There's going to be a rational expectations equilibrium. It's actually not going to be in play. So a rational expectations equilibrium is a kind of communism. And what I mean by that, it's a communism of beliefs and models. So for us, a model is a probability distribution over a sequence indexed by some parameters. In a rational expectations model, three sorts of people share the same model. It's the model builder, it's every agent inside the model, and it's the econometrician, and it's God. So I'm going to back off from that. So and that matters. It matters that I'm going to back off from that. I'm going to use in the background of my thing. I'm going to back off in a couple ways. There's going to be self-confirming equilibria, and that's it's not a rational expectations equilibrium. There's going to be multiple models on the table. There's going to be nature's model, and there's going to be the decision maker's model. It's not communism, and they could be different. Okay, but there's going to be forces that cause them to align along certain events. Okay, that's what's called a self-confirming equilibrium. Beyond that, I'm going to replace everybody at the conference today, rational expectations agents with people who don't know enough to do what they have to do in a rational expectations equilibrium. And what they're doing, they're econometricians who are adaptively learning. They're using kind of machine learning. And as they go along, their learning is affecting the economy. So that's going to be present. And then there's going to be a question, where does that thing go? So under certain conditions, it's going to go to a self-confirming equilibrium, but there can be temporary escapes of least squares from a self-confirming equilibrium. And those temporary escapes, so my pal David Krebs told me that I should title this The Temporary Conquests of American Inflation. So I'll come back to that. Okay, so this is because I've been at this conference all day. The rest of this is self-defense to show that I too have some equations. Okay, but I could come back to that. So there's going to be a discrepancy. A self-confirming equilibrium is vulnerable to a lack of experimentation trap. Couldn't happen in a rational expectations equilibrium. Lack of experimentation trap. And so in this modern day of machine learning, if you know how AlphaGo worked to beat the best Go player, they confronted that. Okay. So in particular, government policy in a self-confirming equilibrium depends on wrong beliefs about consequences of alternative policies that are not tried. Okay, so that's a mouthful. So think about this. The Fed has the wrong model. When it does experiments, those experiments cause it to adopt certain policies, and then it gets data. The data it gets, because it's a big player, are partly a consequence of the policies. And it'll turn out that in a self-confirming equilibrium, the data will confirm the way it thinks the data should look. And if you ask it, well, why didn't you do something else? It'll tell you, but that'll be wrong. It'll have the wrong idea about things it should have done. And so that's going to be a theme. That's going to be a theme, just to tell you. Okay, so that's the end of the technical stuff. Okay, so we begin. The curse. Milton Friedman cited this curse. This is Irving Fisher in 1905. Irredeemable paper money has almost invariably proved a curse to every country employing it. And what's the irredeemable paper money? That's what we have today. It's dollars without the gold standard. Okay. So he wrote that when we were on the gold standard. So And okay, so why would he have said that? Irving Fisher, so that's a line. So contrary to the very modern papers today, I'm taking the long view. And I've been around a significant fraction of this time series. Okay, so what you'll notice is there's 4 countries there. They're hard currency countries. You'll notice that's a log of the price level. And that's before and after ignoring Irving Fisher's warning. And until 1914, the world's on a gold standard. And you'll see the price level ended kind of where it started. There was some volatility, but it ended. And in those days, in 1914, if you had a US dollar, it was a warehouse certificate for a certain amount of gold. And you'd go to the bank or the US Treasury and you got it. And it said, and if you read the dollar, it said, bring this in and you'll get so many ounces of gold. Don't read $1 a day. It says, in God we trust. And you bring one $5 bill in, they'll give you 5 $1 bills. That's it. Okay, so it's a long story, but in 1914, in steps, various countries left the gold standard, and they left it in muddled, stepwise way. Franklin Roosevelt in the United States did part of the way. Richard Nixon did all the way. It was bipartisan. And what you'll see is what happened to the log of the price level. Okay, so why did we leave? Why did we leave? Well, 2 people advised hard currency countries to leave. One was, actually it goes back. They advised it because they heard it from somebody else. Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes. What they said was, what they focused on was volatility. They noticed that, look at that price level, those price levels, there's some wiggles in it. They said, we can do better than that because we know the quantity theory of money, and we could have a well-managed fiat system which would stabilize the price level. And we could do it. And what it requires is a set of instructions, which Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes would tell you what to do. They would tell you how to run a monetary policy, and let's do it. And so the experiment was done. And it took you know, if this were 2000, we'd say, well, it took us 50 years, but we figured out how to deliver that. Actually, we didn't. That's a stable price level, not a stable rate of inflation of 2%. That's not 2%, that's 0. Okay, so my theme is going to be about inflation's north and south after we ignored Irving Fisher's warning. And then, so another thing that's going to be, it's in violation of the spirit of this conference. This is Zach's paper, which is beautiful. I'm going to back off of general equilibrium. I'm going to use one model for the north and one model for the south. And then at the end, I'm going to say something, maybe that was the wrong step. My excuse for doing this is I'm following Milton Friedman. And the models that I'm going to talk about are very Chicago in the spirit of Milton Friedman, both the north and the south. Milton Friedman was a great economist in a whole bunch of ways. One way is he had a good sense of how to break a general equilibrium model apart, focus on this and put this aside. So you'll see he did that. And then Zach didn't do that today, and neither did Marco. So I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so here goes. So the theme of my talk now, this talk starts now. That's all loose talk. So it's a quote from John Taylor. So it's changing economic theories and opinions about inflation are the ultimate cause of changes in actual inflation. So it's that theories affect outcomes. That's my theme. And so what my theme is going to be, there's going to be multiple theories, not like a rational expectations model, where there's one model. There's going to be better and worse theories. And there's going to be learning. In the north, there's going to be Oh, in the South, there's going to be learning by individual people, I'll tell you. In the North, there's going to be learning by policymakers. There's going to be expectations. I'm not going to have rational. I'm going to have adaptive in the same sense that in a primitive way that AlphaGo is adapting to things it observes. And it's got, by the way, there's hot young guys that I met this week. They're using machine learning to solve advanced models. This is what they're doing. Okay, and then this is going to be biblical. There's going to be biblical North and South because it's all about temptations. And this comes from a secular person, Milton Friedman. So there's going to be temptations. And these are temptations which seduced the promise. They're a threat to the promise that Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes said you could have a well-managed fiat system and you could beat a gold standard. Okay, you know. Okay, so, you know, I'm just going to make a inappropriate remark. Every once in a while, some person says we should go back to the gold standard. And he or she, actually it's been a she recently, she's completely nuts. How could she say that? Well, she had that graph in mind. She knew that graph, but that's just, so in the North, what's the temptation? It's to exploit a perceived Phillips curve. So the North is going to be beautiful model of this. A modern model of this is not going to be mine. It's going to be Zach's model today. And then the South, it's the temptation to use the printing press to finance government deficits. That was a little bit present, but back-turned. It was a little bit present in one talk today, but back-turned in the other talks. Okay, so I'm going to tell you North American. Here's this shameless. It's a book I wrote in 1999. And that's what one of my pal Krebs said, because he read the book. He said it's the wrong title. He said it's the temporary conquest of American inflation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about origins and conquests of North American inflation. So I'm going to tell you how inflation started, and I'm going to tell you how it stopped. That's where I'm going. So this is a story that's in my book, but I'm not the only one to tell it. Brad DeLong told it. Romer and Romer told it. I actually think Paul Volcker acted it out. So here's the story. It's all about inferring an incomplete model of the Phillips curve. So remember I told you, there's two models on the table. There's God's model, which is really running things. And there's the Fed's model, no offense, but the Fed's model is an approximation and leaves some stuff out. So then the second step is taking monetary policy based on the Fed's model, which is a non-expectational Phillips curve model. And then so the Fed has a model, you know, it estimates it, and then it takes some, it makes some optimal, what it thinks is optimal actions that model tells it. And then life comes and hits the Fed, you know, in the face, or there are consequences of those policy actions. And then what the Fed does, look, I have pals at the Fed whole careers, and now they use the most recent data to update the model and see what happens. So, so then this story that I'm going to tell you is, well, those data eventually tell the data to refine its original Phillips curve after it detects some missing variables. Okay, so Milton Friedman in 1968 in his presidential address, and Ned Phelps did it a year earlier, he told him what the missing variable was. It's expected inflation that's missing. So in this story, this is a drama, a temptation. They fit the wrong model. The model tells them there's a Phillips curve. I'll draw some elegant pictures, and they see it. They look at this graph, and there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, just like in some, and they see it, and then there's a lot of discussion. It looks stable. It looks stable given given what Eisenhower and Truman did, it looked stable because expected inflation was anchored. There was this trade-off. And then there was advice, exploit the trade-off. And then once you exploited it, the trade-off changed. And it took a while to accept and learn that. And then once you learned it, this is a model of Volcker. Once you learned it, you were going to end up doing something different than you thought was the optimal thing. So that's a story about Volcker. And that's John Taylor's story, the Romer story, and it's my story. But they got better words, but I have more equations. Okay, so here's kind of the components of that. There's a labor supply, and this is right from kind of my version of Friedman. There's a family of Phillips curves that are indexed by expected rates of inflation. There's a family, I'll show you. And I'm going to have modern AlphaGo type adaptive expectations where, the AlphaGo guy, just think, does not have a theory about what the other guy's doing. He's learning from experience and doing, okay, so my guys are going to be adaptive and my government's going to be adaptive. It's got the wrong Phillips curve, but it's not an idiot. It keeps updating it. Okay, so the government is going to learn about a non-expectational or expectational Phillips curves. I'm going to have it. And then there's going to be an escape. So this involves some beautiful exotic mathematics, which I'm not going to go into, but I'll just tell you the math is beautiful. Okay, so here's the Friedman-Phelps thing. There's a family of Phillips curves. I only got two. But all of these slides were made by Rice graduate students, except this one. Okay, somebody else, you'll see. And I'll just say, the Rice graduate students were showing my slides, and I have a completely handwritten slides because I date back to like near the beginning of that graph, and they had to redo the slides. So there exists a family of Phillips curves, and they're indexed by the expected rate of inflation. So now I'm going to show you this morality tale. The Fed at the Bank of England used to say, expected inflation is anchored. Pi is the rate of inflation. Pi t is the rate of inflation on the axis. UT is the unemployment rate. That's what's on this graph. Pi TE is the public's expected rate of inflation. And I got it anchored at 0.02%, because that's what Bernanke said we're going to hit. And that's what Yellen said we're going to hit. And it's anchored. Okay. Why it's 0.02, it's a long story. So if it's fixed, the true model, the truth is going to, the data are going to be scattered around that. So as long as expected inflation is anchored and the Fed does stuff to keep expected inflation anchored at 2, the data are going to come in like that. And it doesn't matter that the Fed doesn't know that there's this family, because there's only one. Okay, but now what's going to happen is, look at this, anchored, unanchored. And what my fast, non-Ricardo Lagos sloppy way of doing it, I'm going to say anchored. You want it anchored? Pi TE is pi E is 0.02 forever, and I don't care what you do. Unanchored is no. Pi TE is actually kind of equal to what you do. If you shoot inflation way up, guess what? Abraham Lincoln's right. People are going to catch on. Okay, so if that happens, then the data, the scattered look like this. And if you were paying attention at Zach's talk, he had graphs of real data that looked like this. Okay, so that's the story. So now here's a big lesson. Robert Lucas calls this the key lesson of macro of the 1970s. And I kind of agree with him. It's the distinction between anticipated and surprise inflation. First-rate distinction. That's what Turing and Shannon were all about, a definition of what's a surprise, something you didn't think was going to happen. So the key thing with a so-called Friedman natural rate is if inflation is expected, the Phillips curve is vertical. there's no apparent trade-off. But if inflation is a surprise, I mean, it's a surprise relative to that anchor, there's a flat Phillips curve. So is it steep or is it flat? So with anchored inflation, there's an apparent trade-off, but it's not exploitable if people will catch on fast. That's kind of thing. So what's in that long book? I have people catching on, and I have the government. I don't know how it does it. It's a black box. The government controls inflation. Yeah, and then the public controls expected inflation, and that's kind of it. Okay, so I kind of combine statistics and economic theory. I got this idea from Chris Sims, by the way. So I just combine statistics and economic theory, and it's a model. Here's it goes. This is the 1970s. This is 1970s, guys. This is Kindler and Prescott's paper. Here's 1970s. I see this. I exploit it for a while. These data come in. The Phillips curve shifts on me. Phillips curve shifts on me. Phillips curve shifts on me. And then I get way up here. It shifted so much I don't want to do it anymore. And then here's what happened. The natural math can happen. There can be some shocks, which actually, so now the spread of the data kind of looks like Zach has, that it can actually spread so it steepens so much that I say, oh man, it's steepened so much that there's no trade-off. And I'm not getting any benefit from this high inflation. I'm not getting any, I'm going to lower inflation. That's Volcker. That's Volcker's endogenous. Okay. So Lucas has a similar. Okay, so now I'm going to completely change gears. That's North. That's the conquest of North American inflation. And in that book that I had, there was a warning because it said with probability 1, it's going to reignite. Okay, and that's the part of the book. This book got published, but it was very quickly remaindered. Okay. I was able to buy a copy for 40 cents at the Strand bookstore. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go the origins and conquest South American. And, Zach would say, you're going to switch models. Yeah, I'm going to switch models. And I'm going to get this model from Milton Friedman too, which maybe not an excuse. So here's the deal. This is all going to be about the temptation to print money to finance the government budget. That's always there. And if you could say, well, that happens in banana republics like Argentina, but it would never happen here. Well, it has happened here before, but it wouldn't happen here now. We'll just stick around. Okay. So here's the components. There's going to be a demand function for real balances. And now there's going to be our friend pi t expected inflation. That's going to position the base of the inflation tax. Pi t, the rate of inflation. That's the inflation tax that's the inflation tax. Okay. There's going to be a government budget constraint, and okay, unlike what's fashionable with some of my students and young friends, there's going to be a government budget constraint. And there's going to be inflation tax revenues, and they're going to play a role. And then there's going to be Laffer curves. There's going to be a family of Laffer curves. And then there's going to be a theory of expectations. Now, my theory of expectations, and you're going to see why I do this, because I could see, okay, there's a trap here. I could see maybe some young people who totally intimidate me here. And they're saying, why don't you why don't you learn something and use rational expectations? I'm going to tell you why. Because you don't want to use rational expectations in this model. I'll tell you why. Okay. So I'm going to use 1990s, AlphaGo expectations. And so there's going to be slippery sides of a Laffer curve. And what I'm going to have is a fiscal theory of inflation. People are talking about this more and more. John Cochran's talking about it. fiscal theory of inflation. Bigger sustained deficits bring bigger inflations. That's it. And Milton Friedman and his students in the 50s and 60s brought this into macro at a time when US had low inflation before the 70s. And why did they do it? Because lots of those students who were from Germany or Latin America or Hungary, that's why. And they had some data. Friedman knew about those data, okay? So this can be a fiscal theory of inflation. And fiscal means a government deficit and how it's financed. Okay, so here's the raw theory. This is 1950s, 60s, 70s Chicago macro, money in macro applied in a nutshell. My version, okay? So R is the real return on money. I have dyslexia, or I think I have dyslexia because I get things upside down. R is the real rate of return on money. That appeared in every talk today, okay? That's R. And it's the price level today minus what I expect the price level is tomorrow, okay? Right now, that's about, in the United States, that's about 0.94. The real rate of return on money is about 0.94. And that's a tax on your real balances, and it's shared by the federal government and the banks. I know William Jennings Bryan was big here. Yeah, the banks are getting some of this. It's a tax on real balances. And then there's this other thing. MT plus 1, that's your nominal balance, is your cash, checks and cash. PT is the price level. Your real balances are the ratio. And I'm gonna remember that ratio, the difference between nominal and real. And Friedman's student Kagan convincingly taught us that there's a positive upward sloping relationship between the rate of return on money and the real balances people are willing to hold. Okay. So the winner on this, I got this from Kagan. The winner, what's the lowest real balances that a country ever had? Okay, so the biggest is the winner for this dubious thing is Hungary. The real balances for the whole country in 1947 were about $20,000, not per capita. Okay, it was for the whole country, and that was engineered. Okay, so really, and the rate of return on money was close to zero. There, huge inflation tax. So there's this graph that the top graph is real balances is a function of the real rate of return on money. Okay, good. This is going good. Well, okay. What's that one? What's that one is, see that one there? Project one is the real rate of return on money is 1. That's zero inflation. And then I pushed it beyond this because of Zach's paper. He had a beta in there today. Beta inverse is the it's a reciprocal of the discount factor. And what Milton Friedman wanted to do is he wanted to drive the real rate of return on money. He wanted to drive it positive. So he wanted to have PT over PT plus 1 greater than 1, which means PT had to be bigger than PT plus 1, so he had to have a deflation. That's what he wanted. Okay, we'll come back. And then at the bottom, that's the inflation tax. It's just a straight line. At 1, you're getting 0. Okay, see that? 1 minus R. And at a rate of return of 1, you're getting 0. At 1 minus R, you're getting your tax rate is 1. You hold real balances, I grab all of it. It was the communists in Hungary figured out that. They figured out how to impose that one. And then they did something really clever afterwards. They really knew monetary theory and used it malevolently. Okay, and then Anyway, so that's that graph. Because now what I'm gonna do is, the top is the base of the tax. The bottom's the tax. So how much revenue do you get? Well, that's the bottom. I multiply M of R, the base of the tax, times the tax rate, and that's my seigniorage that I get. That's the revenues I get from printing money. Okay, that's going to play a big role in in my South American stories, and then that's going to be equal to the deficit. So what's the government deficit? It's the gross of interest rate government. It's the gross of interest payments government deficit. It's government expenditures minus total tax collections, where government expenditures include payment of interest on the debt, which people are talking more about. That's in there. Okay, so now I go, now here's the picture. Here's the whole picture. So on the y-axis, I have the government deficit. It's the primary deficit with the IMF calls the primary deficit plus the interest payments on the debt. That's that way. And I'm going to assume that government sets that. The Treasury sets that. Okay, and that's that horizontal line. And then what's this thing? That thing is revenue from the inflation tax. Okay, so and I'm doing this, you guys were doing this today, I'm doing steady states. Okay, so what there is that's the government deficit. Those are the revenues from the inflation tax. The revenues from the inflation tax have to cover the deficit. Okay. This graph is on coins in Argentina. Okay, so there's two intersections. So this thing, this might ring a bell. That's a Laffer curve. That hump thing, that's a Laffer curve in the something that's a measure of the inflation tax. And it turns out there's two rates of return on money that bounce the budget. There's a low one and there's a high one. Okay. So we have multiple equilibria. So which one are we going to say governs the Latin American data? And I'm going to make a decisive step. Okay, so if we use rational expectations, we could do the rational expectations dynamics. And I'm just going to tell you, see where it says rational expectations dynamics? They go to the low one. They go to the low one. I don't like that. And I'll tell you, I don't like that because for the following reason. It goes to the low one, and let's say I increase the government deficit now in a sustained way. I increase the government deficit. So now it's time for the pop quiz. What happens to our bar, lower bar? It rises. The rate of return on money goes up and inflation goes down. Higher deficits lower the inflation rate. That's not be theological. That's not my old time religion. It wasn't Milton Friedman's. My old time religion is goes the other way. So guess what? You put in AlphaGo guys, and that's not the equilibrium that's selected. Eventually it goes to this one. And I'm calling those least squares learning dynamics. Okay. So my model is going to have least squares learning dynamics. Okay. So that's the whole picture. So now, if you increase the deficit, the inflation tax goes up. So I'm on the right side of the Laffer curve. Okay, most of the time. Okay. So now I'm going to do the following. This is why I'm doing this. Who knows? It's like, okay, I have, I got a perfect grade on a second grade math test because of dyslexia. It was an F. I missed every question because every time they asked me to add, I subtracted and vice versa. And she still gave me an F, even though, okay. So so despite that, I'm going to rotate, translate, and invert. So see the top graph? I'm going to take that top graph and I'm going to transform it to the bottom graph. So in the bottom graph, instead of having R inverse, I'm going to have pi TE, expected inflation. And then I'm going to translate, instead of having the deficit, I'm just going to have the difference between, the inflation tax revenue and the deficit. So it's going to be centered on 0. And then it's going to reverse so the adaptive dynamics that I like are that bottom one. Okay, that bottom one. So that's going to be the graph. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to explain. So I'm going to tell you an enterprise that I engaged in with, and this is using Flavio type methods. So here's the deal. I have a bunch of Latin American countries, and I've got data on inflation from them, from the like 50s to early 2000s. I have those data. Data on inflation aren't too bad. There's also some data on the money supply. It's really bad. I have some data on government deficits. Don't trust it, but I have it, and I don't have it very often. I got monthly data on inflation. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write down a model, and I'm going to write down a likelihood function. So it's a marginal likelihood function in some way, just of the inflation process. But it's being driven by movements in the deficit and some other stuff. But I don't see the deficit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit the model. So this is Flavio. I'm going to fit the model. And then once I have the model with parameters, I can now take the model and I can condition on the observed inflation, and I can tell you what I think the deficit must have been. So I'm going to do that. And this, okay, I kind of understand what I just said, but it took Tao Jia and Noah Williams to actually, write down the likelihood function and do it. It could be done better today. Okay, so here's the graph. Here's the graph that we have. It's a key thing. So I'm going to lead up to this model. I'm going to show you some pictures. This picture is going to appear. Okay, so the dynamics, those arrows kind of lead to this graph called G. So what G is? G is a function of pi TE, and that's telling you what expected inflation is doing. So if expected inflation is down here, that's telling you expected inflation is heading north. It's a phase diagram. If expected inflation is here, it's heading south. So it's heading toward this stable thing. So this is going to be a model where people are learning about inflation from running regressions. They're regression runners. They're just, whatever data comes in, there's going to be shocks. And so the least squares dynamics are driving you toward that with a fixed deficit. And then this is going to play a role. That's true unless somehow some shock, heaven forbid, actually pushed you on this side of that point. Then what happens is, oh man, inflation just heads north. Expected inflation heads north, actual. So this is what we call an escape. And this is building on the, okay. So here's what happens. So here's kind of, so now, so a person like Flavio empathizes and sympathizes and those other things with the likelihood function. So here's this. Now I'm going to look at the following. Look what happens if the deficit goes up. If the deficit goes up, that lower by pi by e, that goes up. That's fine. And the dynamics point this way. But now look what happened to the escape region. It got bigger. Okay. So now what our model is going to do, okay, in the Rice language, this is showing off a little bit because there's these micro guys. We use a hidden Markov model for the you're not the only one who uses those. It's for the government deficit. So it's jumping, and its volatility is jumping. So I don't know how that thing was jumping, but I'm going to specify it. Okay, for Latin America, but I can see the inflation going stuff. Okay, and so so a couple things can happen. I'll show you this graph. So there's this stable region where I'm in there, where the dynamics go like that. And that I have a label for this. That's the the green is the fiscal theory of inflation stable region. That's where the fundamental thing that's causing inflation there is government deficits. And that's the only thing. High deficits cause higher inflation, soon. But that other, if you ever flip to that other side, can't blame it on the deficit. It's self-sustaining. Inflation's going up because it's going up. And guess what? It's almost rational. Okay. So that can happen in this model. So this is built on some ideas of the first guys to write this down were Albert Marcet. I was involved a little bit, and Nicolini. There's a paper. So Marcet and Nicolini calibrated this. We're going to estimate it. Okay, so here's this paper. Okay, so there's going to be it's going to be a model of all dynamic Laffer curves. So unlike at least some of the papers today, deficits are going to be front and center in determining inflation. And this is a Latin American view. The Phillips curve is completely off the table. It's a sideshow. Okay, I'm going to save myself a few minutes. Okay, so kind of what gives rise to inflation? Well, fiscal reforms, lower deficits, lower the inflation tax and lower inflation. They expand the fiscal theory region, and they contract the escape region. Higher deficits do the opposite. So here's this paper by Noah and Tao. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a statistical model and data to infer. Oh, I got to tell you one other thing. What happens if you ever get up here? So what happened in Latin America? So we're going to say, so Nicolini's, I got to trust him. He's from Latin America. He said, suddenly they did what he called a cosmetic reform. If you're from Argentina or Brazil, this will ring. They don't touch the deficit. What they do is they impose price controls, or they set the exchange rate for a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to model that as either moving actual inflation temporary. We're going to suspend the equations of the model, which you can do this with a likelihood function, suspend it, and I'm going to suddenly move either pi e back in here. That's a cosmetic inflation, cosmetic reform. It's not a fundamental reform. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the data to infer, well, what's the cause of the destiny of inflation in these countries? And we're going to be able to infer fundamentals, government deficits financed by inflation tax that caused it. How do you stop it? Stop running deficits. Destabilizing expectations and shocks, that's an escape region. And notice we're giving, like where I come from Chicago or Minnesota, you shouldn't talk about that. It's got to be the fundamentals that determines everything. But okay, and then there's going to be reforms, fundamental reforms and cosmetic reforms. Cosmetic reforms aren't going to endure. Okay, so here's what the model and data apply. I'll show you a picture that I kind of want to sell. So for Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil, we can kind of tell you that there were both escapes and fundamental reforms. And here's these killer graphs. I think they're killer graphs. That's kind of a joke. Okay, look on the up left. See dyslexia again. See on the upper left? Those are those graphs that I drew. But those are econometrically estimated. What from? The inflation data. There's three Markov states. Here's the inflation data. Okay, that's for Peru. Here's the inflation data, Ricardo. So like this is when Ricardo's born, somewhere in here. This is when he comes back to the US. Okay, so all that. So these, look at those numbers. Even these numbers are way above US numbers. Anyway, that's what happened. So here's what we do with hidden Markov models. The top one, we've estimated those lines, and you can see what happened. We project them over here, and then that middle one, we have since it's a hidden Markov model, we have an estimate of what the probability of what you were in that Markov state. So we can do that. That's that fourth one. This one, I'll show you this one. This is Brazil. Okay, this is for Flavio. Okay, look at that. The data are the crappy reported best numbers we can get for deficits. That the straight line is the projected deficit from the model. So you can see it kind of does a good what, and then you can see the 1994 stabilization. You can see what it's contributed to and so on. That's what we do with the model. Okay, so I'm done with the talk, but now, so what? Okay, this is ancient history. To like, I know lots of students don't even know that there was an inflation in the 70s in the US, and I'm going back to 1600. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you some analytics, common sources of where we're getting some of these ideas. The superficial ideas like the Phillips curve and the, the inflation tax thing, that's from Milton Friedman. But the deeper ideas about the statistics, that's from Friedman and his teachers, Harold Hotelling and Leonard Savage. They were doing incredible things. Someplace else is Hayek had a bunch of ideas about evolution. That's here. Okay. You say, why do you believe in rational expectations? You don't ask that anymore, but it used to be challenged. Well, Milton Friedman gave, he did essential work on why you might. One, he had competition and survival of the fittest. That view has been modernized. And least squares learning with a purely statistical model. Friedman, I view him as the pioneer in that. Okay, I'm going to go here. Okay, so I've kind of told you that. Okay, now I'm going to say US inflation today. So now I'm kind of ready to end this with, I had these slides even before I heard Zach and the talks today, Cynthia and Marco. But I'm really glad to have it. I'm going to reconsider Friedman's isolation strategy versus more general equilibrium. Put them both on the table for the US. You don't want these both to be put on the table for the US. Just think about it. So which forces are in play in the United States today? This high level. Learning not to exploit the Phillips curve. And if you read lots of discussion at the Fed, inside the Fed, from what I know, there's a lot of discussion about the Phillips curve that had been shut down. Was it flat or steep or is it temporarily? Okay, same thing. In this, what about South? Using the inflation tax? We'll come back to that, or both. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this is a paper George Hall and I wrote called Three World Wars, Fiscal Monetary Consequences. And this is all just writing down government budget constraints and Fed balance sheets and staring at them. And what are the three world wars? They're World War I, World War II, and the war in COVID. People call it war. Why are they wars? I was in the Army. And what's a big part of the Army? If you're not getting shot at, you're sitting on your butt, not working. And in particular, you're not producing consumption goods. What was the war in COVID? A whole bunch of people were told not to work. So we have a graph in that paper that kind of shows the percentage of the labor force that was taken by those two. And the three things that stand out are these three spikes. Okay, that's one. And then the question is, how are they financed? I'll just show you, I'll conclude with a couple of pictures. So George Hall, I'm going to show you price levels. What we've done is we've taken these three wars. The paper has a bunch of things about how these wars were financed. Were they financed by taxes or bonds or money? And what was the timing? You could go look it up. This is kind of the bottom line. If you look at this is the log of the price level after three wars. You see World War I, you see World War II. Look at that after something happened in the intermediate period. You should ask yourself, why was World War I different from World War II? Okay, that's a quiz. You should know that. But look at the war in COVID, the blue one, a pattern recognition exercise. And every month, George sends me the latest dot. And I don't know whether he's happy or sad, but the dot's right on top of the World War I line. He'll be doing that tomorrow. And then here is the real rate of return on US government debt. This is all US government debt from the start of three wars. And you notice what happened. So if you held a balanced portfolio of US government debt in those years after the war, and there's, so your World War II, you'd get after 20 years, you'd have 70 cents on the dollar, real return. So that's kind of tells you partly how we paid off that debt, quote unquote. And we're on track. Okay. And then the final thing is, because we were talking about the Fed today. Okay. This is the US debt GDP ratio. So this kind of came up. So this is this figure. And so I'll tell you, so it's kind of boring. Well, first you can see what's the debt GDP ratio during and after. Look at World War I. You could see it shot up during World War I, then it came down. And then something happened. It started going up really fast. Do you know why it went up? Like, do you see how it goes up around 1929? Does that ring a bell? Until 1933, it goes way up. That's because prices collapsed. And Franklin Roosevelt, he did not like that because, and you could always kind of look at the rate of return. See if I have it. Anyway. Look at the rate of return on cumulative returns from 1933 up to, from 1929, 1933. Big positive returns to Franklin Roosevelt didn't like that. That's why I went off gold. But if you look at that, so you can, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but look after, do you notice there starts to be the green line, the blue line, the light blue line, do you know what that is? That's unconventional monetary policy, which used to be illegal monetary policy. Now you got to keep track of, and now Milton Friedman comes, okay? Now you got to be track of what actually is what's a bond and what's money. And if you're paying interest on reserves, that's like a bond. And like Milton Friedman said, well, that has fiscal implications. The consequences of that depend on how you finance it. So we could talk about that. And then, so that's going all along. And then all of a sudden, there's that green line. I'll just tell you, that's about shadow banks. So you kind of ask, what's a bank? So this is a Diamond Divvig question. You know, so great. What's a bank? Doesn't have B-A-N-K on a stamped on it. You know, so I'll give you my definition. It's someone unlike you or me who has access to the Fed ledger. And after spring 2021, a bunch of things that weren't banks and were told you could never be banks, they suddenly, $2 trillion worth popped up. And those are money market mutual funds and reverse repos. And then here's the final thing. Look at the dark blue line, and you could say real debt GDP is heading north. Okay, no, it's not. It's heading south, and it's been heading south since. Now, why do you think that's true? So, roughly speaking, in the last year or so, the real value of the Treasury securities on the Fed balance sheet has gone down $1 trillion. And that's the inflation tax. And other people have been taking that too. So now why do I kind of mention that? Well, is it just a North American story, or is it a South American story too? Heaven forbid. That's it.
So we have time. We'd like to open up for a few questions from the audience. If you have a question for Tom, if you could raise your hand and I'll come and bring you the mic.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very interesting. I just wanted to get your opinion. Do you think the U.S. entered into a recession at any point in 2022?
I don't know. So I do know the reported GDP figures when there's negative growth for a couple quarters and there's positive growth this quarter. So I don't know. There was actually this. So here's the type of guy I am. There was this press conference at the National Bureau of. There's a group of economists who officially decide. God knows how they decide. And so there was some meeting of those guys, and there was someone from the press there, and a friend of mine was there. I won't name him. And these guys were discussing whether it's such. So he said, "Well, what difference does it make what you call it to anybody?" Do you know what I mean? So anyway, that my answer. I'm defending my ignorance of this thing.
So I got a question on, is there an element of the Latin American story, if you think of the fact that the US dollar is a reserve currency and part of the inflation tax is being paid by foreigners? And there may be an issue about, what the expectations of the foreigners are and how long they're going to be willing to hold the US dollar as reserve currency?
Yeah, okay. So we could start spending some time on that. So that's a really important question. First, if I showed you in that paper, you look at the balance sheet of the Treasury and who owns Treasury debt. Until quite recently, actually, it was American citizens. We owed it to ourselves. Now we owe it to a bunch of foreigners, whom some of our politicians don't particularly like. Okay. So there are people who think there's going to be an optimal time where I could show you a paper about this, where we fiscal discriminate and we default on some of the debt for some reason. And we treat foreigners differently than domestic people. Have we ever done that before? Yeah, we have. The United States has done it in the 19th century. But we wouldn't do that now. Okay, and then there's people, I just saw a paper last week by some very good young people. They were talking about, the person that runs a reserve currency is gaining some monopolist profits. And we got into that game late. And just from your voice, you people were doing it before we were. Okay. So, and what do I mean by that is if you go read, who did that and did it with kind of American acquiescence. It's the gold exchange standard that was put in place in the 1920s with heavy-handed from the Bank of England. And what they did is it was a gold standard. No, it wasn't. You held British pounds, and the British government was gaining this. And a big thing was Franklin Roosevelt and a bunch of Americans didn't like it that the British were doing this. So a big theme during World War II is the only people fighting weren't the Germans and Japanese versus the American and the British. The American and the British were fighting a lot. And there's this wonderful book, third volume of Skidelsky's biography of Keynes, where he talks about he talks about how Keynes is coming to the United States trying to get U.S. Treasury assistance for the British, and there's an American there, Harry Dexter White, and who's got all the power, and the subtitle of Skidelsky's book is John Maynard Keynes fighting for Britain against the United States to try to preserve British assets, which were India, lots of things in the Middle East, and they wanted Lend-Lease, loans from the United States, and the United States says we were very anti-colonialist in that time. Come and tell us when the colonies are gone, and you've run your assets down. And then the end was after the war, the United States became, we became the monopolist. But, the history of these things is they don't last forever. So like when you guys are my age, it probably won't be the US. There were people in 2000 who said it's going to be the euro. And it could have been the euro if they had kept to the Maastricht Treaty. It would have been. But it isn't. But now there are other people that want to be, so it's kind of a race, like who's going to do that. But it's big time, big senior revenues.
Okay, whether we did or we didn't have recession in 22, and regardless of what you'd like to call it, will we have it in 23?
So I'm just going to tell you this. This is kind of from Flavio. So now what we have to do is we got to go upstairs and we got to fire up some computations. And here's one thing that's very hard to do. And I learned this at the University of Chicago from somebody. It's very hard to predict turning points, like if you're honest. And the reason is because of the nature of the GDP process. If you look at the GDP process, it's serially correlated. And a turning point is a sample path property. It's not about, it's a complicated sample path property. And those things, if anybody tells you they can predict a recession and they know, you should ask them how much uncertainty that do they have. And they should tell you there's a lot of uncertainty. And actually, in truth, there's more uncertainty than even the best guys report, because they're assuming their model's correct. So I could show you something on that. So I'll just say I don't know proudly, which is a way of saying, well, actually my model tells you something, but the bands around it are so big, I got to start shedding it. So my answer is worthless to you. But I know somebody who doesn't use statistics, and he's very confident. And his motto is often wrong, but never in doubt. And he makes a lot of money.
So we have a North American model and a South American model. Where does Japan fit in all this? What's what Japan's been experiencing since 88, right? 1988, with this exploding deficits. And
It's a great, okay.
Where does that fit into this whole picture?
Okay. So this is the start of a really good conversation. And I would start it with Peter's comment about who owns that debt. And I would do, this is what Flavio works on, overlapping generation structure and the life cycle structure, when people work, how long they live, how much immigration there is. And the lot of that, this is going to be abuse of the data. But roughly speaking, unlike the US, the Japanese debt is owned by the Japanese citizens, and that really changes the political economy. And the fact that Japan has a shrinking population really confounds the calculations. And Flavio is, go ask him, and his, because it's not just about, Flavio is building, and other people at Rice, they're building models of life cycle dynamics. This is a nasty term for conservatives, from cradle to grave. Really from cradle to grave, about and social policy from cradle to grave. We spend a lot of time talking about the grave end for older people, not enough, but not enough time for the cradle. There's some really important investments, public investments you can make early on that can have, anyway. I didn't answer your question. Actually, when you get a question like that, the best a nerd like I can do is say, here's the way I think about it. And then you can say either, well, that's a good way to think about it, or I'm not going to think about it that way. Right? Kind of those components.
So we have time for one more question if there is.
With employment so high, has there ever been a time period when employment has been high, but a recession has happened?
Now now to me, that's okay. So I keep looking at Flavio because now he's one of the first guys I talked to about this. And so here's the thing. And it relates to my question, say, like, I don't exactly know how to define it. So here's something, and these are beautiful questions, much better than the answers, which is fine. So if you kind of say something has happened in the United States since COVID to labor force participation, and is it permanent? Okay. And you could say, is it good or bad? Well, you know, this is still an economy in which consumer sovereignty and what the citizens want should reign supreme. If fewer people in the country want to work, they want to do something else, GDP is going to be smaller than if they were working. And that will show up. So, it could have, the unemployment rate is really low, by historical standards, extremely low. It's probably too low. The kind of models, one of the kinds of models we saw today is it's too low in the sense that it shouldn't. Okay, so what's the social role of unemployment? It's to, Marx kind of was onto this, but he had an insight. It's so that there's easy for new businesses to hire people. There's kind of people who want jobs, and there's a pool and you can find them. So there's a pool of people who want jobs and posting jobs. So now, there's a lot more jobs that those ratios are out. Even now, vacancies are much higher than, okay, so that's not necessarily a sign of a smoothly functioning. There's an additional friction in there. So, so if unemployment rose, to 5 or 6%, would that be bad? So GNP would take a hit. Would that be bad? You have to think that through. And actually, at least one of the papers in this was a really nice way to think about it today. Because why? Because it had people inside the model. You could see them. They didn't have names. Their names were IJK, as far as I could say it. But you could identify them, and they were different. And they had different situations and fates, and were affected by, they were affected by fiscal and monetary differently. And, that model could easily be adapted quickly to get at your question. So, I have the Protestant ethic. So I think everybody should be working until they're, 6,000, whatever it was, 1,600. But other people feel differently, and I don't have a right to, anyway.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and thank you for being here tonight. And Tom, thank you once again for
Thank you.
joining us and giving.
Thank you. Thanks.